Welcome to the second episode of Inside Infrastructure, an Infrastructure Partnerships Australia podcast supported by PwC Australia. I'm Adrian Dwyer.
And I'm Ilya Zak from PwC's Infrastructure and Urban Renewal team. So, Adrian, any exciting infrastructure experiences in the last few weeks?
Well, we're infrastructure nerds, so the degree of excitement is probably isolated to a small number of people. But it has been exciting in Australia this week because it's been hot.
And how did that affect you?
Well, I just sat with the air conditioning on, but so did most of Australia. So there's an app I'm currently obsessed with called Pocket NEM, so Pocket National Energy Market.
And what does it do?
So it gives you live pricing in the national energy market. So I've become slightly obsessed with it because you can see in 5-minute increments what the price is to buy electricity in the national electricity market for the wholesale price of electricity.
And what did you find?
So what's fascinating, when there's not much sun, but it's really hot, like it's been in South Australia and Victoria over the past week. So there's not much solar energy, but there's huge demand because everybody's got the air conditioning on and they're all inside. You see the prices spike. So they're typically, when I look at it, like maybe $100 a megawatt hours, maybe the normal price. At one stage, the market was capped out at $14,000 or $14,500 a megawatt hour. But like to the point where I've got kind of obsessed with this app and checking it, like 40 times a day, checking what the price is for absolutely no reason. I don't have to buy energy at that price. I've got a retail contract, so there's absolutely no point in me doing it. But I kind of thought it was cool.
It is interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of, and you can see the different prices between all the different states. You can see the electricity moving between the states, so the market is constantly trying to find equilibrium.
So Pocket NEM.
Yeah, and we spoke to Kerry Schott in our last podcast. It's kind of the you can see on a real-time basis how some of the things she's talking about happening with the different types of generation coming into the market. It's a cool app. What have you been up to?
Well, I got to try out a credit card payment on the train the other day for the first time, which is pretty exciting, using a credit card instead of my Opal card.
So Opal's the system in Sydney for the touch card system?
That's right. Opal is the contactless payment ticketing system for Sydney, and recently it's been expanded to contactless credit cards on the train and light rail network, and I tried that for the first time.
It worked all right?
It worked seamlessly. The only flaw in the process was actually me. I tapped on very excitedly with my credit card, but listening to a podcast on my way out, I tapped off as a force of habit with my Opal card.
So you got charged twice?
I did get charged the default fare twice in that case, because once on the credit card, once on the Opal card. But had I not been the problem, the experience I think would have been pretty seamless. And it's at some stage I'll be using maybe the credit cards will take over, and we'll just be using our phones to tap on and off.
Well, I've got
network.
My watch has a NFC chip in it, so I've used the contactless with my watch. I don't have to go out with anything other than my clothes obviously, but I don't have to go out with like a wallet or a phone or anything. It can all be done from my watch. It's
pretty incredible. It's I guess London has had it since 2013, and Sydney, best I can tell, is still one of the first cities in the world to roll it out so widely. So that was my exciting experience for infrastructure experience of the last few weeks.
So talking about paying for transport, our guest today is CEO of Transurban, Scott Charlton, one of Australia's biggest transport providers. Scott does a great job of explaining who he is and what he does, so we'll go straight to the interview. So hi Scott, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Adrian.
If we just cast back for context and think about young Scott Charlton in Texas, if we asked that young Scott Charlton what he'd think if we said he was going to be a CEO of one of Australia's largest companies, what would he say?
If it was back in sort of those middle school years, he probably wouldn't tell the difference between Australia and Austria like typical, maybe stereotypical Americans. So I think he would be pretty amazed that that's where he ended up, from a place like Dallas, Texas, to be in a beautiful country and living in Sydney and Melbourne. So I think he'd be pretty impressed with the outcome.
So you didn't, as a kid, you didn't have aspirations of moving around the world? Or?
Oh, look, when you grow up in Texas and you start out with everything's bigger than Texas, and people don't consider there's much outside of Texas. I think it's sometimes, and it didn't until I got into university and graduate school is really when I got interested in a much wider concept. And all friends and family that I have, basically all of them are still in Texas. I mean, some of them left, but they all come back. So I'm the anomaly that has left and never returned. But I just really enjoy being part of a much bigger picture. And I think what's exciting about Australia is that we are so impacted by global events, and everyone is so well aware of our place in the global society. But at the same time, a small enough country where you can know everyone, and it's quite fun to be involved in all these different deals with the same people over decades for me.
Were there particular things that you excelled at the time? That were you an athlete? Were you a mathematician? What were the interests that guided you?
Yeah, no, I did play basketball, so that was my sporting passion. I was
just for anyone that can't see you, how tall are you, Scott?
You're tall
just about 6'6".
Yeah,
so,
there you go.
And look, to just to make it clear, on my college basketball team, I was the shortest person on my team.
That's right.
It'd be unsurprising that Ilya didn't play basketball in high school.
Wasn't offered. I was a bench warmer.
Everyone has their place and role.
Yeah.
So there's sports for all kinds. But I actually wanted to be an architect, and as one of my high school teachers told me that I couldn't draw to save my life, but I was very good at math, and so I ended up becoming an electrical engineer.
Right.
So some people know the stories. My first job was designing laser guidance bomb systems.
I've read that. That's pretty incredible.
So that was interesting, and has served me well for those people who have threatened me over my career. But in all seriousness, that was really interesting, and got into the world of infrastructure and finance, and haven't turned back, and just really have a passion for the industry, because you see the impact it has on the communities in a positive way, and also just that it's there to see, I guess, delivered for, or at least for prosperity's sake. But I guess I just like the tangible result.
It's interesting that you mentioned that architecture is what you were interested in, but it turned into engineering, because we find a lot of the industry, whether it's in the engineering firms or not, is it's obviously very beneficial to have that engineering background. Is that something that has been pretty fundamental for you, as far, because I guess the role now is draws probably more on your finance background. Is engineering a really useful grounding for anyone that's getting into this kind of area?
Yeah, I think it's gone through stages. I think when you become a CEO, most of it comes down, I think, which you can affect is strategy and people leadership. So if I look back through my career, I think the best thing that engineering teaches you is just methodically and persevering in solving problems. And so you learn to solve problems logically, whether they're engineering problems or other problems. But then over my career, learning much more on the people side, and hopefully directing strategy and leadership, which is, I think, when you become a CEO, is where you can have the biggest impact, because you are a bit a distance away from the business. But as just a little insight into Transurban culture, I'm also known as the chief architect. So just because you build infrastructure doesn't mean it has to be ugly or bad design.
Right.
So
you get pretty involved in the
look,
design
I was on the design review, the urban design review panel for Westgate Tunnel.
Right.
Along with Victoria's chief architect and quite a group of illustrious architects and designers. I had zero qualification, but because we were paying for the tunnel, I got to sit on the panel. So I think it was one of those sops to my one of my passions. But
so what feature should we expect that's a Scott Charlton signature?
Unfortunately, none of them were my ideas. We did encourage, and which is good to see in Australia, which is very different in the U.S. And Victoria, when they do the big infrastructure projects, they actually allocate a significant amount of money in there for urban design to be a positive impact in the community. That Westgate Tunnel was one of the first major infrastructure projects to actually incorporate Aboriginal design into the whole urban design.
That's striking about Melbourne when you go.
Yeah.
There's a lot more of that kind of striking, iconic component. So CityLink's got them with the the big yellow like girder that comes out.
It's actually called people refer to it as the cheese stick. It's actually it's actually a zipper was the original interpretation.
Yeah,
but
right.
I have to say that the new lighting on the sound tube that was my idea.
Oh, the coloured lighting on the sound.
When we did the upgrade at CTW, we said we need to do something here.
Yeah.
So that was that we really like that. So we get the most tweets of any of our assets is the lighting on that sound tube now. So it's got it's that, and the Balti Bridge have its own Instagram accounts that we didn't set up.
Okay,
that
so
people
fans.
fans taking sort of pictures of sunsets.
So with that with that series of interest in mind, if it wasn't the path that you have gone down, which is mostly, certainly ended up in Australia, but what would you have been doing otherwise? So would you be an astronaut, a chef, or maybe a basketball player?
Too tall to be an astronaut.
Too short to be a basketball player.
Don't like to clean up. Would never be a chef. I don't know. I think, and I try to impart, it's not really wisdom, but I don't think we ever end up where we intended to go. I thought I would be an engineer in the more traditional sense, particularly an electrical engineer and design, and my job was at Texas Instruments, and I never thought I'd get into finance and then down this path. So it's all quite exciting. So my career has taken sort of three big moves, and obviously spent time in construction, both CFO and operations, and learned a lot. And I think as long as you have the passion, and it's always been around that infrastructure, and as long as you continue to have the passion and the enthusiasm, that's the most important thing. That's why I tell my daughter, it really doesn't matter what she does, just have the passion for it and have some fun.
So what brought you to Australia? What was you got your first job in Texas, and then we see you halfway around the world.
It seems like we're getting way off course, but I'm happy to try and go there. But I spent a year again backpacking, going back to interest in probably a more global environment than some of my fellow Texans. I spent a year backpacking after I did my first job and graduate degree, and came to Australia. And I actually met my wife in New Zealand when I was backpacking. We met there and ended up dating later, and it's a long story. And 2.5 years later, we got married, and we were living in the U.S. and spending time in New York and Boston for the job I had at the time. And we both really liked Australia. Let's just come out. We'll go out there for a little bit. And we came here with 4 suitcases and no jobs, and just got off the plane, and we met someone at the airport who said, "Hey, we've got a spare room. Do you want to come stay there?" And we thought, sure, why not? So, when you're young and stupid and that kind of stuff. So it was really good fun. And then, so 28 years later,
2 more suitcases than me. Mine's the same story, but it was 2 suitcases.
And so it wasn't a career move. It was a lifestyle move. But,
it was lifestyle.
Yeah, it's fair to say that most people think our roads are free, or at least should be. How do you go about managing this community perception that roads should be free and continue to be publicly owned?
Yeah, look, and every day we have to earn our right to operate and own these assets, and we need to do that. So we need to be better than the alternative. And if we look at some of the stats, that our roads in New South Wales and Victoria are 80% safer than the alternatives.
Right.
We save our customers across our networks about 320,000 hours a day, and a lot of that couldn't have been done if the private funding hadn't been there, because there's a timing issue from the government. But we do realize that we have to earn that right every day, and so we're continually trying to improve our reliability, our technology, less friction with our customers. And I can go through all the apps, and we've reduced fees and all the good things that we're currently doing, because we have to continue to earn that right to be custodians of these assets, and we think that's important not only for us and our long-term sustainability, but for the industry as a whole, that you can see the private sector involvement actually brings those benefits. And we appreciate that at the end of the day, we're not here to be loved by the public, but hopefully they respect the service that we can provide and the benefits that we provide to themselves and to the economy. And with technology, that's a little bit easier, or getting easier, because we can make the interactions easier with customers, and we can also demonstrate better through the different apps and things we can do, the actual savings and benefits that people do. I do think, and one of the reasons I really love Transurban is that over time we do think, we can talk about technology and other things, that more kilometers are being driven, but we're, I think, in a position where it's a win-win. So the better our networks perform, the better it is for our customers, but the better it is for our security holders. So I do like it as an industry where I think people can benefit, all the stakeholders can benefit.
So I've heard you talk about disrupting Transurban and internally disrupting. So from an outsider's perspective, you think like it's sort of pipes and roads, it's fixed assets. It doesn't seem like something that's intuitively open to being disrupted. Maybe you could just talk us through how you came to that conclusion and how you've pursued the objective.
Yeah, I think there's a few major components. One is obviously our customers and how we interact with our customers. So, we have tag-based and we also have video matching fees if you choose or don't have a tag. But, we decided to go out and create a GPS app for tolling, and that cost us some money. And there was no reason to do that other than there's a convenience. And if we didn't do it, someone else was likely to do it. And it's been quite successful. We've had over 500,000, over 500,000 trips taken with our GPS app.
Can you talk through that, what that is?
And so instead of having a tag or looking at your video license plate, we have a specific app that uses geo ring fencing. And if you download the app, it will tell you if you've gone through the toll road, right, and then ask you if you'd like to pay immediately, and it uses your credit card. So
and then it'll cancel out the video camera.
Yeah. It'll cancel out everything. So real time, you can choose to do your tolling and pay for it and how you want to pay for it. And so it provides that convenience. Now, there is a small fee associated with that, but that, again, is your choice. We always say if you're going to use the toll roads quite a bit, obviously set up an account, it's more efficient. But for a lot of casual users or people who use hire cars or some millennials who don't want to give any of their data up, then they can choose that choice. And it's one of the first in the world. And as I said, we've had over 500,000 trips in just the last 6 months with that new app. So
if I'm a passenger, then it asks me, but because I'm not.
So if you had three people in the car and you all three had the app on, it could ask you, do you want to pay? And then you would just say no, and you could decide who wants to pay.
Okay.
And all that. So it double checks and it won't let you pay twice for the same trip. Okay. So it'll cancel out if you try to pay twice. So again, you can determine how you want it and you can do, but again, it won't let you use it while you're traveling. So it'll only come up when you stop. So from a safety perspective as well. But sorry, that's getting into detail.
No, it's actually quite an interesting. It's also an answer to the previous question, which is that that continuous drive for innovation is one of the ways that you are potentially able to demonstrate value to the community in a way that you wouldn't expect from a publicly owned motorway or toll road.
Sorry to interrupt you, but there's a perception that monopolies don't innovate, be they private or public, because you've got people at one end of your road.
I have to stop you though. You can't use the word monopoly because the ACCC said we're not a monopoly.
Things with natural monopoly characteristics, but that aren't monopolies.
Things with government contracts.
With government contract and a concession, but there would be a perception that you wouldn't have really incentive to innovate like that.
Well, I guess you're right. In the short term, if you were short-term focused, that costs us money. Yeah. It's it's not making us additional money. It's a convenience factor for our customers. But when you go back to long-term disruption issues, we do believe that over the next 20 years or so, there'll be some sort of road user pricing type environment, and that will involve all these technologies and all of our customers. And if you look at companies, and there's so many famous stories, whether you look at Kodak and film, or Ericsson, or Nokia. Yeah, where you say, okay, we got this, doing well, let's just ride this out for as long as we can. And those companies that are sustainable and for all their stakeholders over time, they have to continue to, I don't like the word reinvent, but they have to continue to evolve. And I guess we've formed the view that we have a great base to work from. We have to continue, as I said, to earn our right to license to operate every day, but then we have to prepare for what will be out there in 20 or 30 years. I personally, this is not necessarily a company view, I personally believe that before the end of a lot of these concessions, we'll see the whole world change in the transport sector, and obviously we'd like to play a role in helping to shape that and bring value, again, to not only our security holders, but our customers as well.
I think we're both quite keen to talk about that future.
Absolutely, and it's also it's and the segue, I guess, from it sounds like you're setting up for it with the various innovative initiatives that you've undertaken, and it I guess you're very outspoken on that, on the need for some kind of rational road pricing mechanism. The economics of it are not the problem. The economics are obvious. You know, the more Teslas are there, the less excise is there.
Yep.
But it's not happening. Or for all intents and purposes, there's a lot of talk about it, and no one can see a sort of clear path to having some kind of rational road pricing mechanism. And the closest thing actually is the toll road network that Transurban operates. That's probably the closest we can get to it at the moment. What's holding us back? What is it in your experience engaging with the community, engaging with government? Is it a modern thing that's stopping us? Is it just a really challenging problem?
Well, I think, we all know that, and probably most people listening to this know just the challenging political problem, and it's easy for us to throw it on to the politicians or the bureaucrats, but obviously it's up to us as industry and others to sell it to the wider public. And as most people know, we had our road usage trials and a few other things that we're trying to do, and there is stuff happening in the background. It's not public. Obviously, government's going forward with its freight road usage charging implementation or pilot. So things are slowly happening. I think, unfortunately, for most large changes, that it takes a bit of a crisis. So I think until it comes to a more crisis sort of inflection point, there'll be probably not the opportunity for a wholesale change. Maybe there will be. I mean, I've always talked about the introduction of electric cars as the right time to start that journey, because there can be a transition period given that electric cars don't pay for the road usage. Unfortunately, though, it sometimes takes more of a crisis. I just hope that the industry and others, if that opportunity comes, that we're ready with the right model rather than just a knee-jerk reaction and then we're not ready for the model.
The thing is, though, with the crisis, waiting for the crisis, it seems like, and I don't know if your modelling has considered this, I'm assuming you've modelled everything out for the next 30 years, but it could be a situation where it's actually kind of a frog boiling scenario, where if the drop off in fuel excise is slow enough, the grant funding from the rest of the budget will just increase slowly, and eventually we'll just forget that there ever was any kind of usage charge. Or do your forecast point to a cliff where at some stage excise will drop off quickly enough that it's noticeable?
I think we see the 20s. I guess I should speak more personally. I would say the 20s will be the dawn, really, of the electric car age, and by the end of the 20s, you'll see significant portion of the fleet being sold is electric. So I do think it'll drop off pretty quick on the next decade. But I think if you combine that then with population growth on the other side, road travel becomes cheaper as well through electric cars. I think you'll just see pressure on governments to spend more on infrastructure, and that money has to come somewhere. And I think I'm a firm believer in, as best you can, a user pays model, because again, as we all know, if you don't charge for it, it gets misused, as long as you have clearly the protections for the vulnerable and the disadvantaged.
And there's a fascinating example that I don't know if it exists anywhere else in the world really, but again, one of the toll roads Transurban operates, it's just clear as day. M4, they took the toll away, became a parking lot, toll's back, and you can drive on it again. It's very evident. Do you expect that to be on the same for any kind of same impact in terms of managing demand for any kind of any road? Well,
it was very clear when we were in our road usage study, when you started presenting and we had some financial incentives, when you started presenting the financial outcomes and incentive, people change their behavior. And it was almost even just changing their behavior and seeing how much they were driving and how many trips they were doing. Just people don't intuitively actually know how much they're actually driving and how many trips they're taking, or how inefficient their trips are, that I could have done 4 trips out instead of 6 trips out and accomplish my objectives. So, it's just presenting that information and that cost to the community. And once they see that, they're actually very open to considering a different charge, particularly when they understand and realize that the existing fuel arrangement is actually a regressive tax against most of the community. But it is a very difficult issue to explain, and I don't think we can just blame the politicians or the bureaucrats. It's an industry wide issue, but it will have to be addressed. Coming back to, you could have the boiling frog where the fuel excise just drops away, but at some point somebody's got to raise a tax to fund infrastructure.
So I guess it's worth delving down into that, because it is a prickly problem right now. I think part of the reason why politicians won't do something right now is they're responding to the public fear about having a little black box in every car that records everywhere you're going. If we don't get in at the thin end of the wedge on electric vehicles, we just have the same problem in 5 years' time. There's too many people that are affected by this. So is there a window of opportunity that you see where this has to be dealt with?
Yeah, I mean, my personal view is that window over the next 5 years. So most of the electric cars that we'll see brought into Australia are at the higher end of the price range because of the first generation, and therefore, I guess the follow on from that is the people likely to afford those cars can afford the road use pricing type model and should pay for use of the road. So if you started that in, and then as the fleets get bigger and more efficient, I guess one of the issues is if you tell the traveling public over the next 5 or 10 years, buy an electric car, it's much cheaper, it's much more environmentally friendly, and this is a great thing, and then you try to retrofit that after everyone's made their capital decision. Again, you're creating distorted environments. So I do think that window's the next 5 years as everyone introduces their electric fleets.
But it's interesting that point though, because there's an interaction there with an environmental policy that isn't really the domain traditionally of transport policy, but in Australia, I guess vehicles aren't responsible for the same proportion of emissions that they are in the US. The US is it's substantially higher, but there is still a legitimate argument that, well, I want to. Are you really going to disincentivize my ability to pollute less? Do you see a clear argument to against that, or do we need to resolve an environmental policy in order to enable this more discrete conversation to occur?
Sure, I think you're dealing with two environmental issues. One is first, no matter what type of vehicle it is, because even if you're using an electric vehicle, obviously somewhere electricity is being generated.
Absolutely.
It is more environmentally friendly through that network sort of process. But so the first is if you price the road so that it is used more efficiently or optimally, and then obviously you can price that against public transport or support public transport so that the whole network is priced to be efficiently used and optimally used. That is the best environmental outcome for the road network. Then you have a different issue about what do you do about the types of fuel and how they're incentivized, and should electric vehicles then have a capital discount or a different discount, or traditional petrol-fired vehicles have a penalty because of their emission. I think you got to separate two issues. The first issue I see is you got to get the most efficiency out of the transport network as a whole, and that'll give you the best environmental outcome. And then there's a separate debate on how you deal with the fuel.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I think the worst outcome would be if we started saying, well, we're going to start charging for people to charge their vehicles, if that makes sense, because I would charge my electric vehicle from solar panels if I had the choice, or if I had an electric vehicle. So it seems counterintuitive that I would be penalised for charging from the sun, when in actual fact the impediment on the road network is that I'm taking up lane kilometres and the roads having to be provided for me and maintained for me. And right now, if I was in a Tesla, I wouldn't be paying, or if I was in a BMW i3 or another Nissan Leaf, I wouldn't be paying when the person next to me in a Holden or a Ford or a Toyota is paying.
current settings certainly have potential to be quite regressive with electric cars, and it's important because the more vulnerable parts of the community are sensitive to the price without necessarily being able to change their behaviour. So just how much should we be relying on pricing to flatten out demand through the day?
Well, I guess there's two issues right now. The way the pricing works is, or it has worked, I guess it's crossing that point, is fuel excess has more than recovered what's gone into the road. So
Right.
it hasn't been hypothecation, and I think treasurers and treasuries are now finally get to the point where they understand hypothecation needs to occur. That's the first rule of transparency. If I'm paying this, I want to see where it's going. And I think most of us in the industry would 100% agree with that. I think there is a community sort of obligation or community expectation. And that then goes back to, you have to balance out, well, if there is a cost of that congestion, because everyone wants to travel in peak time, therefore you have to design the transport network to run at peak time. There is a cost to that, and someone has to bear that cost. So that cost can either be borne in congestion, so we don't cover it.
Yeah.
It can be borne in, you got to pay for it, but there might be community expectation that I can't. Therefore, there has to be taxes or somewhere from someone else. Now, someone much smarter and with more political nuances and an economist background should make those decisions, but at least you should have those choices. And right now we don't have those choices on one of them. We can't manage demand.
Absolutely, yeah. And the main way people are paying for congestion right now is with their own time.
Yeah,
But
There's a danger of getting too complex about it. I mean, people understand toll roads to the extent that they pay a fee, they get a premium service, they get from A to B quicker than they would if they went on the free at the point of use alternative. My fear with introducing this argument around demand and shifting peak demand, it's just too complex to explain, and then it falls at the first hurdle. It seems to me that we should be dealing with the funding issue. We've got a dying funding stream in fuel excise. Let's solve that first, and then deal with how you use price to manage demand later. Because otherwise, there's going to be no pricing mechanism to apply price signals to.
yeah, and I think that's right. And I think it can be too complicated, particularly to bring on a system that was going to manage demand in the first instance. I mean, we do have examples now in the U.S. where we have our dynamic price lanes, right, where you pay for capacity. And then...
so can you explain that? Because people might not be familiar with
Sure. So we have what we call express lanes that run parallel to existing free lanes. And if you're... have three vehicles, you can travel for free in those lanes, or if you're bus or public transport, you travel for free.
Sorry,
Otherwise,
if you have three vehicles,
three people,
three
in the
passengers,
vehicles,
right,
three
right.
passengers.
Yeah.
Sorry. Otherwise, and you can travel free. Otherwise, you pay to travel in the lanes, and we'll take the I-95. The average toll there is now up to about $7 over sort of 35 miles, but it can be over $40 during peak times, but you can save an hour and a half. So you can try and manage demand. But what does happen then is we do get some people who then will start sitting by the side of the road around the peak hours or the off-peak hours waiting for demand to fall or whatever. And so then you start potentially clogging up the system that people are waiting, for certain things to happen. And, we actually see that when some of the stuff in New York and elsewhere with mobility as a service from Uber, that Uber's actually caused a lot more congestion because they're waiting to do more Uber jobs. So there can be the unintended consequences. And I think, as you go back, Adrian, the first thing is to get a funding mechanism in place that at least people see the connection between the kilometers I drive and the cost I pay. Make that connection first before we start getting the nuances of managing certain demand.
There's quite a similar kind of challenge in electricity of managing the peak, but for electricity you only need to shave off a very small percentage to save billions of dollars in capex, a small percentage off the peak. How much of how much demand needs to shift from the most congested roads that are in your network for it to actually be optimally to still get people to where they want to go in an appropriate amount of time?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think everyone just has to look at school holidays. You're only talking about a sort of 5% shift, and it can make a big difference.
So that 5% is enough.
Yeah, and that can make a big difference. The only caveat I'd say on that is you still got population that's growing at an extraordinary rate. Right. So, the infrastructure is still struggling to keep up with so somebody's struggling to deal with the existing demand, and then you've got to deal with the future demand as well. So, but it only takes, as you know, most of school holidays can make a big difference to peak travel.
Before we move on from road user charging, you mentioned the road user study that you did. So it was a couple of years ago now.
Yep.
I think you did it. I'd just like to dive into it for a bit, because you had an opportunity not to try and sell this idea to people in a 30-second segment on the radio. You had people go through the process. Can you just explain what you did and how it was set up and what the results?
Yeah, and so we set up a road usage study with quite a few thousand drivers, and what we were testing was not as you said, the science of it. The science is pretty easy, but how do you sell? Not sell's not the right word, but how do you communicate what's currently happening, what could happen, and then people's, I guess, feel or awareness or acceptance of it. And what was quite interesting is when you start, there is little understanding of current transport, particularly road funding, about the connection of fuel excise and GST and rego and how all this fits together. So a lot of perception that roads are free once you pay your rego, and then you pay for fuel that goes in your car. But again, a lot of little understanding of how much of that is actually tax and fuel excise. And then when you start explaining the system, and we had GPSs in the cars, we track people's movements, how many times they travel, and we put them on different systems, a distance-based system, a number of trip-based system, and went through that whole process of education. And when you start and talked about a road usage system, there was almost no recognition or acceptance of it. And then when we finished, we were up into the 60s and 70% said, well, this is the way you got to go. Of course you would go this way because it makes sense. And the distance-based was actually the most sort of acceptable one. And again, when people saw that what they were doing, they were changing their behavior. When they actually got the information, how much it cost, what it could mean. And then they were actually became advocates. In fact, some of them afterwards said, can we keep the GPS because we want to keep tracking what we're doing, because we just find it interesting. And we said no, because it costs us money. But get your government to go to a road usage system and you'll be good. But so, but it is not just an overnight easy sort of shift on that process. But we were able to dispel, and we took a broad community all over Melbourne, and we were able to dispel, quite a lot of urban, I think, myths to that group who actually became advocates. But to go out and say today we're going to do a cordon charge, or today we're going to do, it just would be a disaster. It's a long process that
we see it every time it's raised. Shock jocks are fairly vitriolic about not doing it.
It does have very convenient 3-word slogans that can be used to argue against it, which is a challenge, a communications challenge really, and it's not an overnight solution, but like you said, experiments like this showing evidence that maybe, because for a lot of people, I assume they'd save money. I think plenty of people, particularly the ones in the bush.
It gives you a chance to make a choice.
Absolutely.
So that's the issue now, is you don't really have a choice. So say you're a pensioner who drives once a month to the store. Your rego, I don't know, it could be $1,000, $700, whatever the number is. You're paying a rego, but you're hardly ever using the road, and that's not fair. And then when you've got, if you live in the outer suburbs and you're paying more for fuel because the fuel costs you more, first of all, to be in the outer suburbs because of the way they charge, and then you end up driving so much more, you're paying so much more than your fair share of the road. So it at least gives you a choice. And most of the models that we saw, you could set up a model that is cost neutral in effect. And the automobile agencies were supporting of that as long as the system doesn't cost any more than the current system, but that money is hypothecated to transport, it seems to be a willingness and acceptance at a high level to move forward. But then people would have a choice.
We've spoken about electrification of vehicles, we've spoken about road user charging. You've also done some stuff on autonomous vehicles recently. My personal view is they're a lot further off into the future before that's a ubiquitous thing. What do you think? And tell us about the trials.
Yeah, sure. So I think, and there's a great graph, I forget who did it, and I think we've been through peak hype. I think we've been through peak hype on CAVs, autonomous vehicles. and we're coming off the back of that. And then if you look at history with these technologies, whether it's sort of personal computers or the internet or mobile phones, peak hype usually occurs about 10 years before the reality of it sort of taking off. And so I think we've been through peak hype on the cabs, and I think electric vehicles were probably about 10 years ago. I think that's why we're about to see them start to take off. So I think with cabs, we'll see big differences in the 2030s out there. But all the incremental introduction, particularly electric cars with a number of features, will make our roads safer. But I don't think we'll see the big changes in the.
When you say our roads, you mean
overall the whole networks?
Overall,
the whole networks.
But will they be mostly on your type of big motorway type roads rather than environments?
I guess when you look at the long term introduction, we believe that the motorway networks and the campus style networks, whether a hospital campus or university campus, so where you don't have a lot of where you don't have high speed and a lot of other interaction in a campus type environment, or you're on a motorway, so you don't have interaction with pedestrians or a lot of other things. We think that's where they'll first be mostly utilized, but a lot of the features benefit the whole of the motorways. But it's not until we see the 2030s that we think you'll start getting significant capacity improvements and other things, and then the level 4 toward sort of the end of that decade making a big difference. So I do agree it is a ways off, and a lot of the stuff that we see around some of the autonomous features and people trusting their vehicles can be a bit dangerous at this stage. But it's all moving in the right direction, and we're pretty excited about that future. So we're doing a lot of trials with 7 different car manufacturers that we're working with. It's just a lot of issues to be dealt with about, is it car-to-car communication? How much does the infrastructure communicate? How much data? How's the data handled and moved? So there's just a lot of sort of industry issues, norms to be resolved over the next sort of decades. And look, we're just I guess trying to be involved. We're not leading in any sense of the CAVs, but clearly as a big infrastructure owner, we want to be involved in how we can bring that forward, because that helps our customers and our network.
What is and it's a $1 million question. I don't think anyone really knows the answer, but you talked about the efficiency improvement, which effectively is the capacity the capacity of the roads improves.
So that's just
the cost
travelling closer.
Cars
together.
Can travel closer together, and they're cheaper to operate as well. Yeah. They're safer. That largely deals with the supply. I find that a lot of these discussions tend to only deal with that sort of first order impact of some truck drivers and taxi drivers, I guess, would find less employment in that first order impact. But there's a second round, which is if with these autonomous vehicles, if the cost of travel collapses, and I think you've been on record mentioning that these mobility as a service options are going to be cheaper than owning a car. What does it mean in terms of discretely the road network that you operate? Do you anticipate actually an explosion in the number of vehicles that are going to be travelling on the network?
Well, when you said it's $1 million question, we would see it globally as the $1 trillion question.
Exactly, yeah.
Because with this introduction of technology longer term, I mean, the benefits that flow globally to the economies of all these countries is tremendous. Again, just from safety, the lack of safety incidents or safety benefits that feed onto the medical system and all the other things that are impacted by people hurt in the transport sector. And just through the efficiencies of the economy, because transport is such a big cost to the economy if we can get that much better. So it's sort of globally the $1 trillion question. I guess what we see is less vehicles because they're being used more efficiently, but we see more kilometers being driven. And that's a combination of cost coming down, mobility as a service, connected and autonomous vehicles, and then just the productivity benefits. I mean, if you start going through that, and I know this is further away, whether you work in your car or play in your, whether it's a car or called a vehicle, a pod, or whatever it is, you'll be able to be efficient in that travel mode, less safety incidents. I mean, the flow-on benefits, and particularly for the disadvantaged or the disabled or the young in these sectors that have been limited in their mobility. really quite interesting. And I think that's why, again, why we're so excited about the future is people like Transurban and others can align with, people who are providing those type of services. We all benefit from this future.
There's a very interesting interaction there with our earlier discussion about road pricing, because and I've seen there's a lot of concepts that have been developed about a rolling convenience store effectively, where it'll just travel around endlessly and it can come to you, and it's just a small example of the kind of different mentality that can permeate through the market when the cost of you don't have to pay for a driver. And if you don't actually have to pay for the road, then there's all the road could get just completely flooded with entities that are really they're monetizing a public asset. That's what they're doing, and there's a crossover there where if the roads are not priced, then all of a sudden the M5 might become, a hotel. There's some of these concepts have cars that you can sleep in. They'll take you from your house to work or something like that. If you can do that,
it won't take the premium M5. It's going to be a free route.
That's true. That's true. But
travel all night.
I mean, that's it. Is that something that kind of because I actually personally we've been discussing how electric vehicles are the crisis point for some kind of road pricing mechanism. For me, I think it's the onset of autonomous vehicles, and not because the excise the revenue will collapse, but just because all of a sudden so many new vehicles are going to be using the roads. Do you have a view on how those interact?
Well, if you think of rego, you pay for rego, and most cars capacity is used. I don't know. It's less than 10%. So those vehicles are only using the roads, say, let's say 10% of the time, or less than 10% of the time. So you go down the mobility as a service route, and yes, you might have less cars, but say all the cars are being used 50 or 60% of the time.
Right.
So if those cars aren't using petrol, so they're electric, then you got all these cars using the road a whole lot more and not paying for it. I mean, you take the extreme example, and I won't particularly pick a vendor, but if you have a mobility as a service provider now driving a Tesla, they are being subsidized by the New South Wales taxpayer to use the road network. Now, that's fine when it's a small portion, but that system just becomes unstable if the further you go forward with that kind of model. And the private sector will find a way to monetize something that is free,
as they do today. I mean, the share bikes are but a very small example of that. They're monetizing the footpath rather than a free road, but it's inevitable. And to be honest, before this discussion, I hadn't really thought of how those two developments might interact. But I've also heard a similar forecast from the CEO of Lyft. Not personally. I think he was mentioning it in another podcast. But his view was, I think he was discussing Lyft's equivalent, I can't remember what it's called, Lyft Line maybe, their equivalent of the Uber pool service. And the suggestion was that the average car in America has an occupancy of 1.1.
Yep.
And if they can change that to 1.2, every road is basically empty. You only need it in their modelling.
Yeah, but you need two. It needs to be 1.2 productive people in the vehicle.
Absolutely.
Because the driver doesn't count. So there's two people in there and one of them's just driving around all day.
Absolutely. And it can't just be an extra person that you've shoved in there. Obviously, people that want to be in there. But
I think the issue with that is if you can get 1.2 people because transport's become cheaper, what it means is you actually get more trips.
You get some induced demand.
So that's the issue is that, I just take the example of my daughter who uses mobility as a service all the time. So for her, it's just, I'm popping out and doing this, I'm doing that, because it's just so easy, so cheap, and so convenient, which she wouldn't normally do the trip. She'd make me do it, but...
No, there is upside there.
That's true.
Final question from me. What's your favourite type of infrastructure and why?
Okay, so This is good. Okay, all right. I like tunnels when they're being built. There's nothing better than a tunnel boring machine, and we have the largest in the Southern Hemisphere arriving the second week of January on the docks in Melbourne.
That's for Westgate.
That's
Tunnel.
for Westgate Tunnel, so 15.8 meters. Bella has been her name. So that's fantastic. So I love watching the tunnels. Once they're built,
Bit benign.
A good bridge. It's hard to go by. Hard to go by a good bridge. Balti, even the A25. It's hard to go. The Gateway Bridge in Brisbane. It's hard to go by a good bridge. So,
just drawing on that, I know maybe it wasn't where you were going, Adrian, but what is, so you've got a TBM going in the ground soon. What is Elon Musk doing that's, other than his skates, what is this tunnel boring company of his doing that's supposed to be different?
Look, I don't really want to get in a Twitter war with Elon Musk, given that he has had Twitter wars with other people in the past. But he's using a tunnel boring machine, which is the same tunnel boring machines that we all use in the industry. And
Is it just smaller? Is that the...
Well, it is smaller, but I mean, we've got right now there's a tunnel boring machine with Westgate, which is a tunnel, tunnel, which is about, I think it's about 3 meters diameter, just over 3 meters, and so it's going. So his is, it's just traditional. You can, I don't know if you've seen his video of his tunnel boring machine, and I think it goes for, I think it's a mile. I think it's a mile long or half a mile or something. I mean, North Connects is 9 kilometers.
So did you say 15.8 meters?
Mm-hmm.
The diameter of the...
So it's tall. It's as tall as the dome on Flinders Street Station.
Yeah, wow.
So it's 5 containers stacked on top of each other. It's big.
And so that there'll be a single carriageway.
Yeah, so there's two of them. And then the design there is 3 lanes plus a bit of a breakdown lane. It's marked originally for 2, but can go for 3, and then a bit of a breakdown lane. And then because of the width we needed to have the lanes, all the services are being run underneath the road. So the road's actually on a deck, and you can stand up underneath and service the tunnel
that was my follow-up question. We don't just have to fill it half back in.
So this time it was quite, again, unique design. So all the services are running underneath the deck, and you can stand up in there, and so they'll be able to service the tunnel real time instead of having to shut the tunnel, because they can service.
So if you had to put additional services down it in the future, new fibre, that kind of thing, it can be done relatively easily.
Yeah, but the best thing is that we can service it while we don't have to close parts of it to service parts of it.
That wasn't where I was going with the question. I genuinely want to know what your favourite sort of infrastructure was. But
I'm conscious of time, and there is one question that Adrian and I have been pretty keen to explore. When is the beard making a comeback? And we'll
I swear I didn't put up to this question.
Well, I'm a bearded man myself, and I thought you were part of the club, and you've since left the club, and I'm hoping that maybe it's coming back.
So the beard was associated with a particular deal, and my wife let me keep it as long as the deal was running, because she hated it, and I said it was a good luck charm, which it turned out to be. So I think the only reason it would come back if there was a big deal, which I don't see anytime in the short term. So I don't think we'll see it come back anytime soon.
Well, I guess we can only hope.
All right,
I
Scott,
liked it. Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you guys. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you.